This is the story of life in the States, 1941 through 1945, how America changed during the war years. A lot of people believe that America from 1919 to 1941, leading into the war, was isolationistic and wanted to have little to do with the rest of the world. The truth is actually a lot more complicated than this. Throughout the 1930s, polling indicated that Americans were deeply worried about Germany and Japan, and they fretted that they might have to fight another world war. For example, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor, Gallup asked the American people, which of these two things do you think is more important? That this country keep out of war, or that Germany be defeated? Notice defeat Germany was at 68%, an extremely lopsided win for defeating Germany. By mid 1941, December of 41, defeat Germany had shot up to 97%, and this was after Pearl Harbor. And maybe I should point out that, of course, it was the Japanese who attacked Pearl Harbor, not the Germans. America had already kept Britain free with the Cash and Carry Act and the Lend-Lease program and the Atlantic Charter. Worldwide, our leaders were working with our allies. After Pearl Harbor, almost no one was an isolationist. For example, as members quit in droves, Charles Lindbergh disbanded his America First organization within a week of Pearl Harbor. Now, the war shocked and altered the lives of every man, woman, and child in America. Suddenly, the war was like a gravity. Everybody had to deal with it. This is a bold claim that the war impacted every person in a major way. However, I think that I can back it up. Every person had new work to do. The war consumed their time and their emotions. Whatever one's plans were, they were postponed or scrapped. When the war was over, Americans carried it with them for the rest of their lives. It conditioned how they saw their lives, their relationships, and the world. Now, the soldiers. The soldiers were first populated by 5 million men who immediately volunteered for the war. However, this was not enough. In Germany, close to 15 million had served altogether. Japan's army was over 6 million at its peak. The number who served altogether was much larger. So eventually, the American Selective Service drafted another 11 million men. Now, the soldiers were only given 8 weeks of basic training. And these were men who once worked in farms or factories, in offices or entertainment. And now they found themselves in combat with battle-hardened Nazis and the brutal Japanese military. I want to know how they were trained, because our soldiers became the most effective in the world. African Americans and mixed feelings. African Americans felt torn. Many loved America. But if they lived in the South under Jim Crow, they often couldn't vote, they couldn't attend a good school, and they couldn't otherwise get ahead. So the question was, should we risk our second-class lives for America? One said, here lies a black man, killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of the white man. Now, only 10% of the army was allowed to be black. Generally, African Americans were not allowed in combat. They got stuck in supporting units instead. And yet, they wanted to fight for the double V, victory over the Axis, and victory so that they could win civil rights at home. The Tuskegee Airmen. The Air Force, however, was different. Early on, it let a few black people join. While the first African Americans did low-level jobs, instructors set up a flight training school for about 1,000 men. Now, the officers were barred for the Officers Club. They rode on segregated trains and sat in the baggage cars. Even so, in 1943, the all-black 99th Fighter Squadron went to North Africa where they shot down 11 enemy planes. Here's another story. Philip Randall was a labor leader. And despite the full employment going on in the United States at this time, as unemployment dropped to maybe as low as 0%, blacks in America had a hard time getting jobs in the defense industries, which were high-paying industries. So America's most famous black labor leader, A. Philip Randolph planned a protest march on Washington, D.C. Now, a protest march was the last thing FDR needed. So he sent First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to smooth things over with Randolph. Then, apparently, it worked. These delicate negotiations led FDR to creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Its mission was to give everyone an equal chance at a job. Now, a little bit later in 44, a local trolley company tried to hire its first 8 black drivers. In response, white workers went on strike. Now, striking workers in the United States often had a very bad reputation. In the 19th century, American strikes often resulted in mobs throwing bricks. They resulted in the murder of police, such as in the Haymarket Affair, and then there were events like the Pullman Strike of 1894 in which 30 people died. Remembering these events, including the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and to keep America focused on winning World War II, FDR sent 8,000 soldiers to break the trolley strike. And this is kind of an honored tradition of American presidents, because President Hayes sent the army to break the Great Railroad Strike of 77, and President Cleveland sent the army to break the Pullman Strike of 94. Presidents have often broken up these type of strikes. Now, these actions were stretches for America and for FDR. Now, the president was a Democrat, and since Reconstruction had ended in 1877, only Democrats could win in the South. But the problem for FDR was he had to keep Southern Democrats happy, and Southern Democrats were not very excited about black people and their rights. So this meant if he did anything for black people at all, he usually had to do it quietly, and indeed, there's not a gigantic historical record of great things that President FDR did for black people. But the war, however, was changing everything. Let's talk about women in the war. With 15 million soldiers serving, a lot of jobs opened up at home, and women stepped in. Out, skirts and dresses. In, pants. These new workers welded, riveted, operated cranes, drove trains, piloted planes, managed offices, and they did every job that 16 million men once did. At first, women got nicknames like Lipstick and Dolly. Some were insulted in brand new and creative ways. But eventually, many impressed their managers. Some worked 70 hours a week. Rosie the Riveter came to stand for all women who took on tough jobs for the war effort. Soon, America was outproducing Germany and Japan combined by a factor of 2 to 1. More aircraft carriers, planes, tanks, bombs, and guns. Better tech, more people, more money. Hitler had made what many historians believe was his greatest mistake. On December the 11th, 1941, he declared war on the world's only industrial superpower, the United States of America. A little bit more on women in the military. At first, the military did not let women serve, but the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, pushed to create the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. When he did, 13,000 signed up on the very first day. Ultimately, 250,000 women joined. There are innumerable duties now being performed by soldiers that can actually be better done by women, Marshall had said. Now, throughout his career, Marshall was always polite, and he demonstrated a lot of big picture, long-term strategic thinking. He is also famous for, during the Cold War, creating the Marshall Plan, which saved Western Europe from Joseph Stalin. Children and teens. A lot of young men under 18 lied about their age, and they joined the military. A lot of teenage girls worked in factories. This is Marilyn Monroe, Norma Jean Baker at the time, and she was 16, and a Rosie the Riveter. Everywhere, kids worked scrap drives, they planted gardens, and they stepped up when their mothers, fathers, and other family members were away. Elderly. Often, older people held leadership positions. They were also, of course, hit up for their money. For the most part, older people funded World War II. Had they not done so, had the nation's finances collapsed, who knows what would have happened? Latinos. Unlike African Americans, the U.S. Army did not segregate Latinos during World War II. Latinos were simply integrated with all of the other troops. Something like 1/4 to half of a million Latinos served, as did over 50,000 Puerto Rican men, and 200 Puerto Rican women served in the Army Corps. Also, Americans asked Mexican citizens if they would like to work in the U.S. during World War II. The nation was in the fight of its life, and it needed more workers. Unemployment had essentially dropped to zero, which technically speaking, according to economists, that's like negative 3%. The 3-point difference is people are always switching in and out of jobs. So, therefore, an unemployment rate of zero essentially means that you need quite a bit more workers. And so we imported people from Mexico if they wanted to come. Then there was this incident called the Zoot Suit Riots in June of '43. In Los Angeles, white soldiers encountered Mexican men dressed in zoot suits. The soldiers thought that the zoot suiters looked like draft dodgers. There were fistfights, torn clothes, and riots. When the police intervened, the drunken white soldiers got sent back to base, and the city council decided the solution was to make zoot suits illegal. Now, all across America, culture shocks like these galvanized the local population. People like soldiers were living thousands of miles from home, meeting new people, and doing things that they had never imagined before. Now, some people made friends in these new situations. Other people hated it. Other people were homesick. But nearly everybody lived out stories to last a lifetime. And this changed the look and feel of the United States of America. Navajo Code Talkers. This story is a repeat of something that happened in World War I. Every nation needed codes, and they also needed code breakers. Information kept soldiers alive, and cracked codes got them killed. Sometimes, as the Americans implemented a new code, the Japanese would break it. So over 40,000 Native Americans served in World War II, including 500 Navajos in the Marines. Of these, 400 trained to be code talkers. Their job was to use their native language to send and receive messages about vital military matters. Because Navajo is an unwritten language with several dialects, nobody from Japan had any experience with it. As a result, Navajo proved unbreakable, and thus the Navajo code talkers saved countless lives. Now, despite all this new unity that people in America were experiencing, maybe the common denominator was constant fear. In the shadows of everyone's mind malingered a cancerous anxiety. There would be the knock at the door. The man in a uniform with a grim look on his face would be there. Then these words, "I'm sorry," "your husband," or perhaps your son, or your brother. Sometimes it was your wife, or your daughter, or your sister, killed in action. Over 109,000 Americans died fighting in World War II. Others came back maimed. Many came back psychologically brutalized. For decades afterward, the World War II generation almost never discussed how bad they had it. They understood each other. No matter how bad you personally had it, somebody else had it worse, and everybody knew this. When people lost the person closest to them, they often kept their broken heart to themselves. Now, because of their sacrifices and their can-do attitude, they became known as the greatest generation. The economy. World War II utterly dominated America's economy. Taxes on the wealthy shot to 88% or higher. Practically everybody else paid more as well. Now, to prevent tax evasion, the government instituted the withholding of taxes from every person's check. This had never been done before. Now, without getting too detailed, almost everybody in America was paying higher taxes and less able to cheat on taxes. The national debt, too, shot to unimaginable levels. If you look at the peak of the graph, that is World War II. America had borrowed 112% of GDP. This was the highest ever, over 3.5 times the size it had been in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War I. Now, 16 years before, the debt had grown from that point to 7.5 times larger. Many economists thought that this borrowing was both uncharted and terrifying. But the question was, what choice did the United States have? Simultaneously, the country printed so much money that inflation threatened to plunge America into a second Great Depression. If you want, you should look up hyperinflation. Look up Germany in 1923. Look up Argentina. Look up Zimbabwe. Hyperinflation destroys the savings of practically anybody in a given nation, and indeed, it pretty much destroys the whole nation. The government had to try to do something that would work in the short term, but it would create a wave of strikes, unemployment, and recession immediately after the war. There were prices being frozen, wages being frozen, raises being frozen. The government wanted to print, borrow, and spend, and yet have no inflation. The government knows that this is not possible or desirable in the long term, but they were desperate. They had to make the money work. They had to make it work somehow. So as unemployment dropped to zero, employers wanted to lure good workers and with higher pay, but they couldn't. Paying more was actually illegal. It was illegal to give people raises. So employers started offering wages plus benefits. Now this is a sneaky way to give somebody a raise without giving a raise. That's why since the 1940s, health insurance is a part of most people's salary. Now it's playing with dynamite to try to tamper with the basic laws of economics like supply and demand. All of these actions create shortages, overpriced items, underpriced items, and black markets all over America. Even so, a lot of Americans didn't necessarily want to cheat the system. Their attitude was, we're a team. There was an Office of Price Administration, and then this one was later disbanded, thank goodness. And then the point of this agency was to dictate the wages and the prices. There was also the War Productions Board, and this was where America repurposed thousands of factories. Car factories now made planes and tanks. Typewriter manufacturers now made bombs and guns. Henry Ford's Willow Run factory could make a B-24 bomber every hour. Henry Kaiser's West Coast shipyards cut the time to build a merchant ship from 105 down to 14 days. Germany had nothing like this. Japan had nothing like this. The Soviet Union had nothing like this. Nobody had anything like this. The agency that had commandeered thousands of businesses was the War Production Board, and ultimately it gave the Army everything that it wanted. And as I've mentioned before, America had turned out twice as many war goods as Germany and Japan combined. Soon, there was rationing as well. Every house received a ration coupon book. No matter how much money you had, you could only buy so much sugar, meat, coffee, shoes, and gasoline. Now, the WPB, and to many average Americans, they all promoted shared sacrifice, which meant not cheating the system or buying black market goods. However, I think it must be said that black markets in these situations are inevitable, and people do cheat, and they don't report it when they do cheat. With unemployment being at close to zero and everybody working hard and production being at an all-time high, Americans actually were stacking up cash. And they would like their comforts in life. But the funny thing was, nobody had anything they could actually spend the money on. People were beginning to get kind of rich, but there was nothing to buy. And yet, in the midst of all of this, Americans, of course, were stressed. So, people would do just a little bit of black market cheating, as mentioned. Let's talk about the culture. In addition to changing every American's life and radically redirecting the economy, the war also re-scripted popular culture. I will give several examples. Professional baseball. The draft depopulated professional baseball, and instead it went to 15-year-olds, retired athletes, and other unlikely refugees from what's just called in the island of misfit toys. Now, with so many players gone, the owners had a new idea: the American Girls Professional Baseball League. To keep it respectable for the 1940s, athletes wore dresses, applied makeup, and had to go to charm school. The league drew large crowds. Newspapers. Desperate for war news, Americans needed their newspapers, and the number of war correspondents surged to 500 compared to the 100 for World War I. The most famous columnist of all was Ernie Pyle. His column appeared 6 days a week in hundreds of newspapers. Radio. If almost everybody read the newspaper in the morning, they clustered around the radio at night. FDR continued his fireside chats. These deepened his bond with the American people. The chats were very popular, and every president has given a weekly address on the radio ever since. Movies. Within the first 6 months of the war, 70 war-related films appeared, all designed to make Americans feel patriotic. Some real classics came out of this, maybe the ultimate classic of this genre, Casablanca. These movies pushed heroism and sacrifices, and the good guys won. Movies were only 10 cents or 25 cents a weekend for a double feature. You'd have to multiply this roughly by 15 to put it into 2017 dollars. Now, before the feature, people saw newsreels, which showed current events. While honest about the setbacks, the tone was relentlessly pro-British, pro-American, and pro-Allies, and unfortunately, pro-Stalin. Stalin was said to be one of the good guys. Hollywood and media followed along. This man is your friend. He's a Russian. He fights for freedom. Well, he didn't fight for freedom. Russia stops Hitler. Well, it kind of did. So, it was a mix of truth and lies. FDR and other people at the top suspected that Stalin was a mass murderer, but they needed Russia to stay in the war. As Churchill had said, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make a favorable reference to the devil. FDR had said, if you treat Uncle Joe like a member of our club, perhaps one day he will behave like a member of our club. Stalin never behaved like a member of anybody's club, except for the mass-murdering dictator's club. After World War II, the American media went back to normal, which meant you could hear all kinds of different voices, and then eventually the truth about Stalin did come out. A lot of Americans, however, couldn't accept it. Maybe the propaganda of the war years, where everybody had decided, hey, Stalin is on our side, maybe this basically kind of paved the way to make Stalin look good to any number of people. Stalin himself referred to people who supported him as useful idiots. Ultimately, nobody during the war actually suppressed the First Amendment. If a newspaper wanted to be anti-Stalin, anti-FDR, or even anti-World War II, they could print it. America had made free speech illegal in World War I, and it appears that, at least on a scale that massive, the U.S. had not repeated that fatal error. Rather, what appears to have been going on instead was journalists wanted to beat the Axis too. So I guess you'd have to say there's sort of a conformity effect. It's not an obedience effect. It's not an effect where people are telling the journalists and the movie makers, you have to support the war. Instead, I guess the World War II equivalent of trolling for likes on social media. You don't want to put an unpopular opinion out there and have everybody hate you for it. Comic books. Superman debuted in 1938, just a year before the war, and Captain America in 1940, just months after the war, and soon both were fighting World War II. Almost every superhero socked the Nazis in the face. Swing and the Big Bands were the popular music. There was Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole. People loved and still love the big band sound. People in this era loved to dance, especially swing, the jitterbug, and the Lindy Hop. The United Service Organizations, the USO, these were Hollywood actors, pop stars, and comics who crossed the globe to entertain the troops. Comedian Bob Hope, who lived to be 95, led the first tours. By the way, nurture your sense of humor. A lot of comedians lived to be well over 90. You could look it up. Now, did the public ever disapprove of fighting World War II? The Gallup polls I've indicated seem to say that the war still had a 75% approval rating nearly 4 years later in 1945. Now, since the advent of polling, as far as I know, every American war starts off with public approval, but then those numbers diminish over time. World War II dropped from 97 down to 75%, but it's probably climbed back up since then. If you poll the average person, was World War II worth it? Should the United States have entered? Are you glad that we beat the Nazis? Most people are going to say yes. To this day, it's kind of hard to find any Americans who believe the opposite of that. Now, the Korean War started off with a 78% approval, but dropped, I believe, down to the 30s. Vietnam started with 61 and certainly dropped down to the 30s. And even the Afghanistan War, which started off at 93%, basically all of these ended with far less support than World War II had. World War II ultimately transformed the world. It placed almost every American on a shockingly different life path. In fact, it refashioned billions of lives across the globe. Some nations became better because of the war. They became more open, more free, educated, and wealthy, and willing to help people in need. Even West Germany after the war and Japan became peaceful and free societies and strong American allies. They became democracies and free markets. However, half of the world soon descended into a socialist Soviet nightmare. There were hidden prisons called gulags. There were secret police. There were plenty of executions without trials. It was the end of freedom. There was the rule by terror and the Cold War. And somehow, all that was only the beginning. Soon came an unimaginable threat. The possibility that all human life on Earth might be blown to smithereens and go up in an atomic mushroom cloud. That is the end of life in the States.